right? How do we use services? We learned about that. We will go detailedly about what is services and how to deal with them, right? Angular service, yeah. So a few points we discussed about service, working with the service as a predefined business logic, which can be reused in any application. And we discussed that actually service is a combination of factories, and factories are injected into services. Factories can have directly functionality, but factory is using single call mechanism, right? And singleton services use a singleton mechanism. So basically we discussed that we need some reusability, maintainability, testability among the components. So, and we need some content to be reused across, then we need this actually. So how these services are configured, how these services will work. So we will see. Technically, it uses a singleton pattern. I already told you, services use singleton pattern. And singleton pattern means object is created only once. Generally, how we create an object for any class, how we create an object for any class. So that means, so we have to create an object so that through that object we can access and use the service. So generally, we have to create an object by using the new keyword, right? We have to use the new keyword. So creating a service and injecting into your application requires an object actually. Technically, we need an object. So actually to create an object, we have to rely on the new keyword. Instead of that, now actually Angular service uses Angular service uses dependency injection it uses dependency injection to inject a service into any component constructor. Angular service uses dependency injection to inject a service into any component constructor. So the main intention of service is nothing but, as I already told you, what is dependency injection? A simple point I will give you. So Angular services use dependency injection. So the main concept is instead of creating the service object using new keyword, right? So instead of, you can simply say that, so we say new operator, right? Yeah. Instead of creating a service by using the new operator, so we use this dependency injection mechanism to inject so the service into the component. Actually, so what is the advantage of this dependency injection? What is actually dependency injection? Few points you need to know actually is dependency dependency injection is actually is an application design pattern. It is an application design pattern. And one important point is Angular has its own dependency injection framework. Angular have its own dependency injection framework. So it is used in designing of Angular applications. So for actually Angular uses dependency injection framework to increase the application efficiency, right? And efficiency and modularity. Generally, it is used to improve the efficiency and modularity. Modularity means, so that means only what is required for that situation is used. That is what actually. Technically, dependencies are nothing but, so you can simply say that dependencies are services or objects that a class needs to perform its function. Technically, dependencies are services, and or you can say objects that a class needs to perform its function. Already I told you, we need some particular functionality. So if you need a particular functionality, you don't need to write that functionality. You can inject that functionality and use that functionality, right? And how this is performed actually is, technically dependency injection is a coding pattern in which a class asks for dependencies from external sources. So rather than creating them itself, that means already that means the point is, a class needs some functionality. If a class needs functionality, generally class itself configures functionality. That means already we know class comprises of properties and methods. Properties contains the data, methods defines the functionality. So class itself have functionality. So, but we don't want class to create any functionality. We want class to use the functionality. That means we don't need to create any functionality inside the class. We can just inject a functionality from any external source. Right? What is the advantage of that is, you can reuse the functionality. You can share information across classes. So it allows to share information between classes. That is the main key point here. So it allows to share information between the classes, right? So how the dependency works? Technically, dependency injection in Angular, what happens is, in Angular, the dependency injection framework provides declared dependencies. It will provide the declared dependencies to a class. So when that class is instantiated, when the class is instantiated, this is very key point you need to understand. That means in Angular usually dependency injection framework, technically dependency injection framework, provides declared dependencies to a class when that class is instantiated. If you have any doubts, towards the end we will discuss. Keep a note about your doubts. After the class we will discuss. Okay, right. So in Angular, the dependency injection framework, the intention of this dependency injection framework is it provides the declared dependencies to a class. So when the class is instantiated, that means when a class is created, that is the key point. So when a class is created, we have to define. So actually, the key point, another you need to know here is the dependency injection framework, actually, the dependency injection framework. So the dependency framework, injection framework, lets you to supply data to a component from an injectable service class, from an injectable service class. That is what the key point here is. It allows to supply data through an injectable service class, right? That is the first point. How to create an injectable service? How do we configure an injectable service? So is very important. We will see how we can define it. Means how the functionality works and how we can configure it. So before that, yeah, let's start this and yeah, let's Amazon. Okay, so services use dependency injection. Technically, services use dependency injection. So, and what is dependency injection? One point I told you, right? Basically. And here, dependency injection provides, the framework provides declared dependencies to a class when a class is instantiated. Generally, class is instantiated by using a constructor. Technically, class is instantiated by using a constructor, right? Okay, another important point is, so a service internally uses this dependency injection. So here, the class technically, you can say that technically, service in Angular is a class. So one point is clear that technically service is a class. Technically, service in Angular is a class. So it comprises of several service methods. So you can say that which comprises of a set of service methods. It contains a set of service methods. So it is a service class which contains collection of service methods, usually service methods. Now, important is to configure a class as a service. So we need a decorator. And the decorator is, so the decorator is the injectable. This is important. The injectable decorator marks a class as a service. So which that can be injected, injected. That means you cannot inject any class. You cannot inject any class directly into another class. So with dependency injection mechanism. For that, if a class have to behave as a service, then a class have to use decorator called injectable. Usually decorators are defined with at the net, right? We know that decorators are defined with at the net, decorator, with the at the net injectable. So it marks the class as a service. It marks the class as a service. Actually, Angular cannot inject any service anywhere until you configure an Angular dependency injector actually. So a service, the point you should know is Angular cannot inject any service, any into into component. It cannot inject into component until you configure an Angular, dependency injector, with a provider, This is very important. This all, if you know, you can handle your interviews in a better way. So generally, right, because you should know the hierarchy. Because in interviews, if you show experience without having experience, then obviously they can track your levels and understand that, okay, you just faking your experience, you don't really know it actually. So that's the reason, if we know the in-depth architecture, that means behind how every concept works, means all the hierarchy, one inside another, then you can handle the interviews at experience level. At fresher level, this much in depth, they may not ask you. These days, we can't expect that, because these days for freshers also, they ask so much in depth about the concept. So for experienced persons, these are mandatory. So majority experienced people in interviews are tested in concepts like forms, in concepts like routing, in concepts like services, filters, right? That's the reason you need to be perfect. So what is the point here is, Angular cannot inject any service into a component until you configure an Angular dependency injector with a provider. What is actually dependency injector? What is dependency injector? What is the what is the concept of dependency injector? What is the concept of dependency injector? Actually, so that means, so here one question regularly comes here is, what is injector? What is injector? Because you cannot deal with a service without knowing about injector. So that is the first point. So that means injectable will mark the class as a service that can be injected into any application. First, I actually suppose I will show you a syntax. See, so we have to import injectable. Suppose I said injectable from Angular core. So from Angular core library, from Angular core. So we have a class export. So we have export class and the class name. Technically, any class name we will define. That means some demo service. Okay. So here I am just giving you a basic syntax here. Yeah. So the basic syntax we are trying here. Let's see. Okay. So this is syntactically how you configure. Okay, fine. Right. So now injectable is a marker. That means we have to mark this as injectable. Injectable is a marker. This injectable marker, usually this injectable marker, make this as a service and allows this service to be injected into another component. So Angular cannot inject any service into a component until you configure and dependency injector with a provider. This injectable is an injector. That means injectable is an injector. Injector. What is actually injector? Technically, what is injector? Actually, it is an object in Angular. In Angular, dependency injection in dependency injection framework. Dependency injection system actually. Injector is an object in Angular dependency injection system. What it will do is, so it can find a named dependency in its cache. That means memory in its cache, or it can create a dependency using a configured provider. So what is a provider? We will see now. We will discuss about that. It's by using a configured provider. Provider is very big, important point. Again, we need to know about it. Okay. Technically, injectors are created. Technically, remember this point. Injectors are created for ng modules. It is created for ng modules automatically as part of the bootstrap process. What is bootstrap process? Already I told you, converting the static DOM into DOM. So as a part of bootstrap process, injectors are created for ng modules automatically as a part of bootstrap process. Injector is an object of Angular dependency injection system. Now, what an injector provides that you should know. Actually, injector provides a singleton instance of a dependency and can inject the same instance into multiple components. This is important. So who is responsible for injector? If anyone asks you in interview, FAQs I will give you. If anyone asks in interview, what is this injectable? So inside your service declaration, what is this injectable? Then you should say that it is an injector. Actually, technically, you should say that it is a marker. Okay, injectable is a marker. So if anyone asks what is the purpose of this marker, then you should say that it works as an injector. Then if anyone asks, what is an injector? You should, why you are using an injector? You should say injector is an object of dependency injection system. It finds your dependencies present in the cache. If not, it can create the dependencies using a provider. What is a provider? I will tell you. And what it will do is, so it will, actually injectors will provide a singleton instance of dependency and can inject the same instance into multiple components. So actual point here is, technically, this injector is now injected into a component and provided with different implementation mechanisms. It can be used by their own components and child components also. That means the injector provides a hierarchy, so that so the content can be used. The content can be used for the parent or child components It can be used at any level for parent or child components. Parent, you can say, and child components. It can be used for both of them. Parent and child components level we can use. Actually, we can configure injector. With different providers. We can configure the injector with different providers. So that can provide different implementations of the same dependency. So that means now actually injector needs a provider. This provider will tell the purpose, how it happens and how it works. Means where it should work. It will tell. Right. So technically, now here the important point is, what is injector? I hope everyone understood. In dependency injection, injector is one object which identifies the dependencies, which finds the dependency from the memory, or it will create the dependency, and it will make that available. This will happen at the time of bootstrapping and make the dependency available to the parent component, or to the child components at any hierarchy. And we configure injector by using a provider. Technically, what is a provider, and what this purpose of provider is actually provided. So that means here one more immediate question comes is, what is provider? What is provider? We need to answer this also. Actually, provider is an object. So actually, provider is an object that implements. So one of the provider interfaces. So generally, provider is an object here. Generally, provider's main purpose is it defines how to access the data, how to obtain injectable dependency. That means provider defines how to obtain an injectable dependency associated with a dependency injection token, actually associated with any dependency injection mechanism. So that means usually injector uses a provider to create a new instance of dependency for a class, uses provider for creating a new instance. Actually, Angular registers its own providers with every injector for services. You can register your own providers for services that your application needs, that you will see how we can do that. Technically, provider defines an object which is used by injector. Provider is used by injector. This will obtain the information about the injectable dependencies and allows them to be injected into your component. Injector injects the dependency and provider tells from where to get these dependencies. It will get the information about the dependencies. That is very important, right? So we need this. Now, that is the part. That means we need an injector, and injector needs a provider. How the provider is defined actually in a service generally, this is a service. So you will see practically. So then you will understand, right? So there is nothing, already you saw that Angular registers its own providers with every injector for service. What does that mean? That means whatever the components required to use for a service, they are automatically registered. So it will register those components and it will use them implicitly. Angular registers its own providers means Angular internally knows from where it has to get the data, or you can explicitly tell from where to get the data. Understood? Right. So technically now the point is how you inject the services. This is the key point. That means this provider has a certain syntax. So see here, how to create a service I will tell you later. Temporarily, I will show you a simple service automatically. Suppose I'm just using a integrated terminal. I'm creating here ng generate service. So service name, demo service, demo as a sample. Okay, sample is a service name. And skip test. Okay, we are generating a service. So ng generate service and service name is sample actually. Okay, and skip test. So later I will show you manually how to create the services, right? First, we will see a service, how it looks like actually. A sample service is created for us so that we can observe it. So let's observe that service here. You see there is a sample service .ts. This is a sample service. And you can see that this sample service is actually a class. Fine, it is a class. And this is defined as a service by using an injectable. So injectable makes this service to use a dependency injection mechanism so that this can be injected into other components. So from where to get the dependency related information? So where the dependencies are present, that is defined by using provided in. That is defined by using provided in. Later, I will tell you some more points about this provided in. So actually, when you go to definition, provided in, you can see provided in contains options. See, it is using an injectable provider, and it is having root, it is having platform, it is having any, it is having null. So provided in can be empty, provided in can be empty. What is injectable providers? So, and their values. So many injectable providers will be there. So this is a very complex concept that you don't need at this level. You don't need that. But the point you need to understand that the information about from where to get the dependencies is defined by using this. What is the meaning of provided in root? I will tell you, we will discuss about that. Actually, the point here is, so injectable, why it is already I told you. Provided in, that means it is specifying from where to get the dependencies. From where to get the dependencies actually. So you can put as root. You can put as, there is another technique of writing it that also I will show you in routing concept, you can say. So that means this root, by default, if you don't define also, it will work. If I don't define provided in also, it will work, no problem. So you don't need to define this at all. We can just keep injectable. It will work. But provided in will specify exactly from where the dependencies need to be accessed. Dependencies need to be accessed. So generally, when you configure the dependencies, that means we have, I already told you that we have provided in, right? Provided in. That means, what is the purpose of this provided in? Is nothing but provided in root indicates that it is the root application injector. That means it gets the information from the root application injector. From the root application injector. From the root application injector means, so it is getting information from the root injector. And that means application root level. So there is another concept of application level. Instead of root level, it can be module level also. It can be module level also. So that means it can use the module level. The provider tells an injector how to create the service, right? How to create the service. And important is the Angular create injectors at the root level or at the module level. These 2 points are there. That I will show you while working with the routing concept, because in routing we will learn, till now we learned how to create components. For example, we are working for a project. So for an app, okay. In this project, so we have 2 domains actually. We have an admin domain we have a manager domain, we have a customer domain, we have customer. Three different domains are there. So for admin, you have some admin related components, admin login, admin related registered, admin related some home, so many. Manager have his own login, so manager have registered, so manager have some home, something like this. Customer have his own login. I'm telling about components. So it has registered the components. That means the components can be at any level. Now, generally, we need this type of hierarchy. Till now, what we are doing, we are creating all components at one place. But actually, these components, these are all components actually. These components are actually kept inside. That means they are grouped in, these components are configured and grouped in. So these are all components actually. These components are usually grouped in a module. That means we have an admin module. We can configure manager module. In these modules, these components are defined. So modules, components are defined. Components are defined. Now, important is generally when you create a service. So generally when you configure and create a service, usually, so the service once you define, so we can create the service for root or for child. We can have two options. Internally, actually, they use this mechanism actually for root or for child. That means exporting for root or for child. So that means we have to export for root or child. Export service for root or child. And that is what actually services are internally using. Internally, they are exported actually. We are not manually exporting them. It actually exports them. There are two options, so root and child. If you export a service for child, then what happens is, so this is available for child, means it is available only for that particular module. That means in which, for which module you have configured, it will work only for that module. But when you export as a root, then it is at the application level. That means it will work for all modules. It will work for all modules. So this type of hierarchy I will show you while learning about routing. We will discuss about that, how to create such modules and how to use them. Actually, there are different kinds of providers actually, different kinds of providers. So usually providers will define where to configure the component. That means you can configure for a module, you can configure for an application. So it is defined by provider interface actually. So provider interface will provide that. So dependency injection, injectable injects the dependencies and provider will obtain the dependencies. So you can simply say that injector will load the dependencies and the provider is accessing those dependencies, technically, that is accessing the dependencies. So usually how the dependencies are accessed, we will see that. There are several types of providers actually. So so much more concept is there. I am not going that much in depth. So that is for the people who know several other architectural patterns actually. So providers are again several types actually, like class provider, non-class provider. We have a value providers, right? So the intention of the provider is to tell the to tell from where to access, from where to access. So it has two options actually. So it will define at provide, it will provide and it will access the value. That means it has two options. Providers usually provide, and usually they use value. That means usually provider will be providing and using the value. Providing for application level, so and use value. So that means where you want to use the value. So for any particular module, for any module. This is not required. So just you need to know that actually what does provided in root indicates. Provided in root indicates that you are providing at the root level. We are providing at the root level of the application. We can provide at the child level for the application. That also we will see. For that we need to create modules. Here how you configure. So we say provided in, and we need to define provided in. You have any platform or root. So we are using root. So what are the various providers? So I will tell you. So what is the difference between them? We will tell. Initially, the first option is root. That means for the root level of application. Actually, if you define as so provided as any, then usually any indicates that technically it will work at any level. That means the root level or the child level or at the workspace level also. That means you can access from any another application and we can use from another application also across the application. Here root is only for root level of application, That means only for this application. That's what actually root is. So syntactically, that is the meaning of provider. We will see one example, then you can easily understand the other parts also, right? Initially, this is okay. That is what actually provided in. So from where to obtain the dependencies is defined by this, right? Next point is, okay, our service is ready. Then how we can inject the services? That means how to inject services. Injecting services. For that, we need to follow certain rules. So what are the points to know about injecting the services? Okay, service is created. So in order to inject the services, so into any specific component, and you have to use that, you can tell Angular to inject a dependency in a component's constructor by specifying the constructor parameter with a dependency type. Constructor parameter with a dependency type. That means actually injecting services, what you have to do is, so you have to inject the service into any component. Okay, that is the point. Now for that, what we have to do is, so you should here keep very important point is, you make sure that service to be injected rather than creating its own service instance, right? So we have to make sure that that service need to be injected. Make sure that service is injected into component rather than creating a new object, It is injected into that rather than creating a new object. So you can simply say that creating a new instance rather than creating a new instance of a service, we need to inject a service. So that means you can tell Angular to inject a dependency in a components constructor, in a components constructor. So in a components constructor, you can tell the Angular to inject a dependency in a components constructor by specifying a constructor parameter. Constructor parameter with the dependency type in the dependency type. So that means here the key point is you can tell the Angular to inject dependency in a components constructor by specifying the constructor parameter. Here, observe carefully here. What we are doing is, so we created the dependency, means we created a service, some sample service. Now, any pipe, any service that you created is not recognized by your application. You know already that. We go to app-module.ts. In the app-module.ts, you can see providers. So there is providers. What these providers will do? So go to the definition. You can see providers. Providers is having provider. It is derived from provider. As I already told you, that provider is an object that implements the provider interface. You can see it implements a provider interface. Go to definition of this one. So this is the type provider. It is the type provider. And actually provider is an interface. So, and you can observe here, I told you that there are several types of providers. There is a type provider, value provider, class provider, constructor provider, factory provider. These are all different types of providers actually. Angular provides different types of providers. Like better, I will give this name also, it will be more informative to you actually. So Angular provides different types of providers. So this point is important. That means Angular registers its own providers with every injector for service. Its own providers, I told you. And Angular provides different types of providers by its own. What are those providers? We have the providers like this, like a value provider. So a class provider. You have a type provider, and you have a constructor provider. These are all provider, different types. We have a factory provider. These are all different types of providers. Angular provides different types of providers. That means now when you create a service, you have to tell, so from where the information should be gathered, what information should be gathered. So the dependency can be any value, it can be a class, it can be a constructor, it can be a factory. Factory means collection of functions. Now you can see really the word factory here. Factory means it is a collection of several functions. Factory is a collection of functions, right? So technically, the main intention is, so we have to register that in the provider. That means here we are defining a provider. and I am configuring the provider. So what is the provider? Provider is sample service provider. Now, can you tell me which type of provider is this now? Can you tell me which type of provider is that? Sample service is which type of provider? Which type of provider means, is it a value provider, class provider, type provider, constructor provider, factory provider? What kind of provider it is? Sample service is what kind of provider? So sample service is a class, na? It is a class, am I right? It is a class, right? What kind of provider it is? Good, right? Good. That means, so it is a class provider. It is a class provider. Currently it is a class now. It is a class provider. It is a class provider. Suppose you define, so new sample service like this. Suppose it's an array. We are configuring something like this. And it has some constructor and all, right? Yes. Right. Technically, this type of providers, array can accept this type of providers, but it should have a constructor. That constructor must be defined, right? So this is an, we can create an object for that, right? That is an object provider. So constructor provider. You can have a value provider. We can pass a value here. It can be a value provider. We will see different options in different occasions. But currently, this providers, so it is a set of injectable objects that are available in the injector of this module, And injectable objects, remember, it is for injectable objects that are available in this injector. Provider, we can pass different options. Now we are mentioning just a class provider. So sample service is just a class provider. That means now what it will do is it will inject this class into the cache, inject that class into the class into the cache memory. It inject the class into the cache memory. After injecting the class into the cache memory, it is available in the cache memory. Now, who is responsible for obtaining it from the memory? Its information and provide to the other components. Who is responsible for obtaining this information of this class from the memory and provide to another component, inject into another component? Who will do that? Can you tell me who is responsible for accessing the dependencies of this class? In service who? Which object? Injector object is injecting it. Who is obtaining it? Injector object is injecting it. Who is obtaining it? Who is obtaining and providing to the component? Who is obtaining? Who is obtaining and providing to the component? Provider. You should say provider. Understood? Who is obtaining? Provider is obtaining, na? Am I right? Injector is injecting and provider is obtaining the information. Am I right? Huh? Provider is obtaining the information. Right. That means it is obtaining the information. Who is obtaining the information from the injector? So from the injector, who is obtaining the information? So that is done by provided, and it will provide to the application. How it provides to the application, that's we will see. That means how it is provided, we will see that. That means here the point is, So these are all different types of providers. We have value provider, class provider, type, constructor provider, and all. So you can tell Angular to inject dependency in a components constructor by specifying a constructor parameter with the dependency type. This dependency type means service type. Service type. You can say that it is service type by defining as a service type, by configuring as a service type, right? Yeah. That means what is the service type? Service type means in any component. Suppose let's add a component. So let's go to some other component or add a component. So let's add a component also. So ng generate component sample consume. Okay, skip test. Okay, I just given as sample consume. So we are not seriously using it, just reference for understanding sake. Okay, let's go to this sample consume. Okay, in this what we have to do is, as I told you, right? So you can tell Angular to inject the dependency in a components constructor by specifying constructor parameter as dependency type. That means you can tell here into the constructor dependency type like sample service, sample service, SER, sample service. Okay, it is of what type? It is of type sample service. That is the sample service type. It is of sample service type. Now you need to inject that. You have to use it. Nah? If I have to use it, then we need to find it. So you have to import that sample service. You can import that sample service. One shortcut is, generally shortcuts, you know, I think you don't know generally. Suppose why this is not working, because we have to import its service. Your Visual Studio Code has a lot of special abilities. Simply what you do is put the cursor in that particular name and you have to use control CTRL plus dot, control dot. If I press control dot, it will get from where this service can come, and you select it, it will automatically import it for you. It will import it for you. That is shortcut actually. If dependencies are not resolved, you can resolve it. Now we are creating a sample service object. This sample service object. So that means what you are doing, you can tell Angular to inject dependency into components constructor by specifying a constructor parameter with dependency type. Dependency type means service type, constructor parameter. Now tell me why we need to define this in a constructor. Why we need to define this in a constructor? Why we need to define this in a constructor? Technically, why we need to define in a constructor? Tell me why we need to define in a constructor. Define in a constructor. So why we need to define in a constructor? Because the sample injector is dependency. Yeah, that is very important point. So this is the point I highlighted, if you remember. So the point I have highlighted. So you see here, Angular, the dependency injection framework provides declared dependencies to a class when that class is instantiated. Understood? That point I highlighted, right? So provides declared dependencies to a class when that class is instantiated. Usually when the class is instantiated, means usually when the class is instantiated when it is loaded. when it is loaded, that means constructor is loaded. When the constructor is loaded, that means in the constructor you have to configure. Now the dependency injection works. It will it will get the dependencies from this particular class. It will get the functions from this particular class, and that means it is loaded into memory. You don't need to create an object. So without creating an object, it is loaded into memory, and that memory can be accessed by using the reference of this sample service. Reference of sample service. So by using that sample service, you can access the components of that particular diff. So that means actually this mechanism, that means services can have their own dependencies. So, but important is you can apply the same constructor injector pattern, adding a constructor that takes longer parameters. You can add any number of parameters actually, any number of parameters. Actually, this mechanism of configuring is known as, constructor injection. This is called as constructor injection pattern. This is called constructor injection pattern. So that means the constructor asks for an injected instance of that sample service, right? That is what actually the concept is. That means the constructor will ask for an injected instance of that particular service, Now, in that service, usually in this service, there can be several methods. Suppose I have a method called, suppose get data. Get data is a method. I have a method called post data. Post data is a method. These are service methods. Post data, get data are service methods. We have a service method. Now I will go here, and here I want to access that. Here, how we can access on initialization or anywhere. So we will create one method, or we want to access that. We can use this dot. Here we have actually sample service. See, can I access this sample service? So anywhere else. So that means inside the constructor, because that is constructor parameter, na? It is constructor parameter. We cannot access that anywhere else. Sample service is not accessible anywhere else. So sample service is not accessible anywhere. This object is not accessible because it is just a parameter. Then usually what happens is this parameter sample service, that is the parameter. This sample service parameter can access those get data and post data. So through sample service, we can access that get and post data. Service methods can be accessed. Service methods can be used here. That means we are accessing those methods here, and we are configuring those methods here. We are accessing and configuring those methods here. Generally, when you are configuring and defining the methods here, that means in the constructor itself, they are eagerly loaded. In the constructor itself, they are eagerly loaded. And after eagerly loading, you can define it for a local reference and access outside it. That means what you can do is, here we can create a public some data, and we can use this dot data. Data is equal to, it will get the data and use it. That is how you can do. That means now this is accessed and used it. That means in a constructor, you configured it, and we can access and use the data. We can access and use the data outside, anywhere you can use now. This dot data will get the data. That is how we can configure, actually. We can configure. But this makes an eager loading mechanism. That means even I don't need this service method to be called. That means constructor is loaded. So that means the memory is loaded with all the service method. Even you don't need them, because without loading them, we cannot access this. We cannot access this. That is the reason. So we use a mechanism. So what we do is we make this sample service as private. This is an habit. Without that also you can do. Now in interviews, anybody may ask why you create a private method, why you create a private type of that particular sample service. Usually I define this as private. Any member which is configured as private in the class constructor, it is accessible for that particular class anywhere inside the class. Am I right? Private access specifier allows you to access the member. Private is an access specifier, right? Modifier. It allows to access anywhere inside the class. Am I right? Can we say that? It is accessible anywhere in the class. It is accessible anywhere in the class. That's what we learned about private, na? Right? So you made the parameter as private. Actually, parameter doesn't require any access modifier. If it is not defined with any access modifier, then it is accessible only within that particular constructor. Understood? If you don't define any access specifier, it is accessible only to that constructor. But we want it to accessible to that class. I hope you understood. We have to accessible to the class. If you want to make it accessible to the class, then we defined a private constructor for that. This private parameter for that. This private allows this parameter as a class scope now. It allows that class scope. That means it can be accessed anywhere within the class. Now this dot, so I can access that sample service here. Understood? I can access that sample service here. If I don't define the accessibility, then any parameter is accessible only within that constructor. It is accessible within the constructor. Now the question is, can I use public? Can I use public? So you can use public, you can use private, you can use protected, you can use protected. But all those, you know the reasons, the difference between them. Usually a service object injected into a service object injected into a service must work only for that particular class, only for that particular component. It should not be accessible outside that component. Only for that component service need to be injected. In that case, we have a habit of making it as private, right? So without private also, it will work. No problem, it will work. Then how to access the service related members outside? Then what you have to do, we have to create one reference. Through that reference, this dot data, through that reference, we have to access sample service related methods. Whatever data is returned by them, we have to access that and we have to use it. But this makes this as eager loading because this is loaded even when we don't need it. It is loaded even when you don't need it. That is the reason we have a habit of configuring this as a private, so that it is made private to this particular class. Parameter is made private to that particular class. So this parameter, if it is not defined with the access modifier, then it will be only within that constructor. This private makes it accessible within the class, so that anywhere in the class we can access and we can use the methods. So anywhere we can access and use the methods of that particular service. This makes lazy loading. That means only when it is required, it will load. Otherwise, we have to keep everything loaded ready in the constructor. From there, we have to access it. That makes heavy for the application, right? That is how we need to configure the service. And we will see one example now. Means how do we define the service? How to this is not example. This is just a hierarchy I showed you. That means how we can inject a service. Generally, injecting a service, configuring a service, we need to know these points. And very important is here, every parameter defined in constructor is accessible only within the constructor. So you can define an access modifier. You can define an access modifier, access specifier or modifier, access specifier. So modifier. You can define an access modifier. So to specify the scope of parameter as private, so public or protected. So why we need to do that? Because without that also we can do. So because many times in interviews they ask, is it private mandatory? No, private is not mandatory. So in that case, we use eager loading mechanism that is very risky, right? So if I make this, why you are making private only, not public or protected? I can make public or protected, but generally the instance of this component should not be available to another component. Suppose you are using parent-child hierarchies and we are transporting data from one component to another component, then you can make this public in access. So other than that, you can restrict the accessibility only for this particular component, right? That is injected. So how we can inject and how we can inject and use in a component location. So that means here we are using this dot sample service dot get data like this, right? This is a sample syntax, actually, just syntax, how we can inject and access that. This is all understanding about what is a service and how do we configure the service, right? Now, how to create one service, how to use the service in our project, in our implementation, that we will see tomorrow, right? In tomorrow's session, we will discuss about that. How to configuring the service, working with the service. In tomorrow's session, we will discuss. This is all you have to know about service at any level of experience. At any level of experience, even you put 10 years experience, then this is enough to handle. That means this is enough to handle interviews, right? These points you need to remember forever, right? Then how to implement with an example, that we will see. Then we will get more clarity on its functionality. Tomorrow we will discuss about that. Okay. Right.